I think we're streaming and live, and hopefully you can see and hear us properly. Welcome again to the Westdale and our Monday Night Film Talks. This is actually our 16th week in a row, if you can believe that. We started in mid-March, and recently we've been inviting guests to come and talk about their favorite films in more of a conversation. So please, if you have any questions for our guests, please ask them. Tonight, I'm very happy to welcome back Colin Doncaster. Colin was with us, 2 months ago, I think, right, Colin?
That's right, yeah.
Talked about The Lord of the Rings and his experience working on that movie when he was down in New Zealand and working in visual effects with Weta. And lots of interesting stories about that film and how that came about. So I was thrilled that Colin agreed to come back and talk with us again. And tonight, Colin's going to talk about another favorite film of his, which is Luc Besson's great movie, The Fifth Element. And very interesting movie. I watched it again this week. I'd seen it on the big screen, fortunately, because that's certainly a movie. If you can watch it on the big screen, you should. But it's amazing. I thought it really stood up and very funny and entertaining. And anyhow, so tell us a little bit about this film, Colin, and why it's one of your favorites, how you first got to know it, and everything else.
Yeah, I mean, when it was first released, I think I was still, maybe the first 3 or 4 years into working in the visual effects industry.
What year was that? Was that 97 or 98?
98 is when it was. They were shot it in 97 and released it in 98. It was actually one of the, I think it was the second or third film that James Cameron's Digital Domain worked on, like properly. And I remember, reading about the film. I actually had heard of Big Blue. Luc Besson did a film, Big Blue, which is an incredible sort of diving film with Jean Reno, previously shot. And then, of course, The Professional he did beforehand. So I was a bit of a fan of his. But when The Fifth Element was released, just the trailer, again, it probably to me was like when Star Wars came out, it was I was 1 or 2, so I didn't have that moment of seeing the trailer of like, oh my gosh, what is this film? So besides, I think the only other film I got as excited about was Jurassic Park when that was released. So The Fifth Element came out, and there was all this imagery of these locations in space, these beautiful people, the great creatures and locations, and it just had it's something about the sort of French touch to it that makes it that much more magical or just different from what I had been exposed to. So I remember rushing out. I think I actually went to the theater and watched it on my own. I snuck away from work, and there was a 2 p.m. screening, and I managed to sit in the theater and watch it on my own, and was just blown away that I went back and watched it, I think, an 8 p.m. screening the same day. And just fell in love with the characters, and it was one of the few movies that that really gave me the opportunity to escape. It's sort of, if I was going to imagine a film or a world that I would step into and feel like I was transported to this magical place that wasn't a fantasy land, that was actually science fiction, and in the future it was this world that Luc Besson had created for The Fifth Element. And I think it was part of the allure was that it didn't take itself too seriously in a way, and in it, like, it actually really is a comedy film when you get to the base of it, and that's one of the things I remember reading an interview with Luc Besson, and when he was trying to coax Bruce Willis to do the work, he'd actually he was trying to get a big name Hollywood actor to play the main role. And he was originally Mel Gibson was originally on board.
He went to Mel first.
Yeah, Mel Gibson first, and then also Tom Cruise and Kevin Costner were on board, but they weren't available.
Yeah, he couldn't pay, and he didn't have enough money either. So
yeah, that's right. And it's interesting in the interview, he says, there were some up and coming stars like Brad Pitt and Keanu Reeves who he was considering, and then he ended up going through various drafts, because we can kind of get into the development process, but really he wrote it. It was one of the first films that he actually wrote when he was deciding to be that he wanted to become a filmmaker.
Wasn't he like 16 or 17 when he had the
Yeah,
idea?
he was really young, and he held himself sort of. I guess he was going on trips with his parents because his parents were divers, and that's how he got into doing The Big Blue. But during that period was sort of a lot of influence for wanting to create this world. And when he eventually sort of made the decision that he wanted to actually become a filmmaker, a serious filmmaker, he sat down and wrote a few drafts. And I think the first draft was originally the plan was going to be 2 films.
That's right.
And they needed all this money. So they needed a big Hollywood hit star. And he had met Bruce Willis through Demi Moore. Yeah. And eventually one thing led to another, and he ended up doing The Professional and La Fendakita, and then got a chance to come back to, and I think The Professional was, he wrote in 20 days and shot it within a year.
Yeah. And what was the other one? The other one, Leon?
Well, Leon's The Professional. Leon's
Leon
French,
French that was a successful film. That made him made a bunch of money. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, and I think that's sort of what gave him a little bit more notoriety in Hollywood, because he knew that to make The Fifth Element happen, he needed to have a U.S. partner. And he was, a lot of it was going back and forth with Warner Brothers, because Warner Brothers was a partner in previous projects with him. But I think because Columbia was done, Leon Professional was done with Columbia, and they had such a good rapport that they ended up just saying goodbye to Warner Brothers and brought Columbia on to eventually make it with Columbia. But Bruce found out, I guess they went through this rewrites, narrowed it or squeezed it down into just one film with a much more concise script. And he was looking at some of these new actors, the Keanu Reeves, and actually I think he did a audition with Keanu Reeves. And then Bruce Willis called him up out of the blue and said, "What's happening? I thought you and I were kind of doing this thing." And Luc Besson said, "Well, I don't think we can afford you. And Bruce said, "Well, if I like the script, I'll make a deal." And so he ended up going to New York and went and visited Bruce, gave him a script. He had 2 hours to read it, so he wandered around New York and jumped on board. So that was interesting. And
by the way, Bruce made a great decision, because he took less money up front but got a much bigger back end that was worth a ton of money, because that film did like $240 million. So we don't have to feel sorry for Bruce Willis.
No,
but he does that. He's an actor who will take less money to be in a movie, and good for him.
Well, originally, the discussion when he first met Bruce Willis with Demi Moore, he said to Bruce, "Would you be keen on doing it?" And because he had a few dud films, he was really nervous about taking on something unique or different. But between that original discussion and when he agreed to come on board, he ended up doing 12 Monkeys and a few other films, a few other films that just gave him a little bit more standing in Hollywood. So I mean, Bruce Willis has a lot of standing anyway, but it's amazing that he made that work. So that was sort of an interesting. I think it was just a really, really cool film that just had this vision that I just hadn't seen. I think I mentioned I really liked Jean-Pierre Jeunet to you previously, and City of Lost Children, and that was not as accessible, whereas The Fifth Element was a film where it brought a lot of the similar sort of French details to the world, but with way more accessible for North American audiences. So yeah, I just really got excited about it.
Well, all of the casting is sort of interesting. Obviously, the casting of Mila is a story in itself as well, right? Because she was a 20-year-old model, right? I mean,
that's right. So he had gone through, and then I have to sort of call it. I've got this. I managed to find this great book. So a lot.
Oh wow!
So this is the. It's the story of The Fifth Element, the adventure and discovery of a film, and basically it's the last 60 days or the 60-day shoot in Luc Besson's journal, and then there's at the back of it's a lot of concept art. So I sort of dive into that a little bit more, but it goes into I basically, it was when I found it, because it wasn't that easy to get a hold of back then, and when I found it, I just sort of ended up consuming it as well. And it was interesting because Mila Jovovich was a model, and so he met her and I guess just fell in love with her eyes and her image and everything. But he had ultimately narrowed down the casting for Lilu to 2 models and 2 actresses.
Right.
And the studios really wanted to go with the actresses because they were a known quantity. But he was convinced that Mila was the one. She wasn't the actual, interestingly enough, the body type that he originally had in mind for Lilu, a little bit more petite and smaller. But I guess, he managed to capture her heart, or she managed to capture his heart in many ways, of course, over the course of the production. But it wasn't until, again, he went back and met with Bruce and said to Bruce, look, I've got these 4 actresses. I'd really like to go with this unknown. She's a model, but I think she's great. And Bruce had said to him, look, if you think she's the right decision, I have complete faith, and got behind it. And sort of that made it sort of all happen for the production, and got the studio on board. But yeah, she was unknown at the time, as far as, she's done a lot of modeling, but unknown for acting. And I think that, one of the things in the audition tapes that he had mentioned is her just the wisdom that she brought to the character, that she seemed to be a lot more experienced and a lot more sure of herself than a lot of even the actresses. And so she really,
one of her unique qualities, she spoke 4 languages.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
So when it came to inventing this new language, she was actually up for that and did a good job.
Able to pick it up. And that's one of the things that, he makes a point of saying, is that it sort of opened his eyes to looking at casting outside of standard, because there's a whole world of people who can bring so much to the films. And if you just go through standard casting channels, you may miss out on the perfect character, the perfect person to play that character that brings so much more to the film. And I mean, I don't think that it would have been the same film if Lilu hadn't been Mila Jovovich. She just made the whole production. And I think, that was a big part of it.
As I understand it, she went through like 4 months of training. She learned martial arts, and she was really put through a real acting school and training for the film. And you can see it in her performance, I think.
For sure. Yeah. It's like, again, it sort of, it goes back to that feeling that what she's doing as this trapped creature is almost, just comes naturally to what she's doing and how she's actually reacting to this and who she is. Yeah. And that's, even as Fred, as a producer, to find people, actors and actresses that can actually become the characters, where it's just second nature.
It takes method to the next level, because there's not a method. You just, you are the character. I read somewhere that he had said that he knew he had to fall in love with Lilu, because at the end of the day, it is a film about love. And of course, I guess he had that, that experience when he met her, that this is a woman I can fall in love with. And in fact, he did fall in love with. Yeah. And even though he was married at the time and his wife is in the movie, they soon were having an affair. And I think you feel somehow that emotion he has for her as a performer becomes transferred to the audience, right? Somehow we have the same love for her,
That's right. I mean, it's hard not to, there's moments when she's in the back of the cab when she first meets Corbin Dallas, and she's falling through, and she the beautiful blue eyes, and she looks at that, she says, "Help me." She learns that's her first sort of words in English. And just the way that whole, it just emotes the whole character, and you just feel connected to her, and you want to see her be saved. And the part, going back to the concept of her being representing this fifth element, which is love, with Luc Besson, I think he said he was struggling a lot between making a very action-oriented comedy and this very philosophical, deep sort of storyline, metaphysical storyline about love, and how love is this fifth element, and it keeps the world around. And in a way, I guess, finding Mila with Lilu, it was almost his muse, where it sort of tied that whole storyline together, where he was able to still tell this comedy but because of that connection with her,
Right.
sort of it comes out in the storyline as well. So I think that was navigated very well, because
It's
it
really
could have.
incredible, actually. It is, it's what we always talk about in filmmaking, where there's so many different elements, and they all have to fifth element, but they all have to align. The
Right.
great films have that incredible fortune, and I don't know how directors do it, where they just are able to bring everything into a whole, and aesthetically and philosophically. I heard a story when he showed the film to his father. His father said, "Oh, this is a remake of Plato."
Right.
Because Plato, of course, talked a lot about the four elements, right?
Yeah.
So
And it's also pretty interesting to think that the original storyline was written when he was much younger, like a 16-year-old.
yeah, I know.
And there was a lot of this quite deep, and I would love to know, I'd love to see the evolution of the drafts of the script, to see how it went from, initially encapsulating this fifth element in love, and the sort of very philosophical standpoint, and if that was there from the beginning, or if that was introduced at a later
I don't
stage.
know. I heard there was one draft that was 400 pages, and then he wrote
That's
another draft that was 400 pages. So
yeah, and that's how you go when you've got a story to write, and they had a script doctor brought in from Columbia, and that was the person who was able to narrow and really tighten the script up to bring it into what it is.
Robert Kamen, right?
Yeah.
And Robert Kamen became his collaborator
That's
on
right.
Transporter and many movies after that. And you're right, Kamen was an established Hollywood kind of guy. And I think you're right. I think his influence on the script actually made a big difference too.
Yeah. Just
so someone's asked, Kathy's asking about the language, and where did that language come from?
Well, I know that it evolved from that. They actually talked to a few anthropologists about the evolution of different languages, and it was a heavily influenced from tribal languages, of course, because again, it was sort of this deep rooted, and then I think they talked to Mila a lot about the languages she heard or knew, and that sort of became a part just to make it easier for her to talk. I do actually, if I've got a little screen capture.
Oh,
So
yeah,
in the
why
book,
don't you show us that? That's really interesting. Yeah.
So here's this, which I found amazing. So they actually broke down they call it Lilu's language into, in the actual English, and Akten Chinu. You can kind of see a lot of these words she uses a lot, but there's a lot of really interesting cadence to it. And he talks a lot about when, a big part or importance in the language when it is being devised or created was, there's differences. Like if you hear German is quite different from English, because in Germany the words are very concise, where in English it's actually if you don't know English and you listen to it for the first time, it sounds like you're singing, and that's something that was sort of important to capture the idea of the cadence of the language, where the to be able to convey the correct emotion that the character was going through at the time, and ensure that the language was able to do that. And like if you again, my wife is German, so I know it quite well, but if you hear people talking German and they're being quite serious, or they're actually telling a joke, there's actually it's hard to tell the difference between.
But basically Besson created a 500-word language.
That's right.
And in fact, he and Mila would talk on the set in the language, and nobody else knew what they were saying to each other.
Yeah. And I guess that helped if they were forming this relationship offset as well. They could kind of talk a little bit more closely. While I'm sharing my screen, so one of the things that I love about the film, and that I've got a few other pictures here, is that you talked about how directors are able to pull together a team to really convey or build an image or visual sort of style for the film.
That's right.
So when the film was first done, before he made The Professional, Luc Besson managed to pull together so Mobius, who's an amazing, famous French comic book artist, and Mézerie, and a team of artists to put together, to do all these concept art based on what he was, sort of discussing with them, and the script, to the format of the script at the time. But another interesting collaborator, even from the very beginning, was Jean-Paul Gaultier, who designed a lot of the costumes for the characters, and especially Lilu, and it was interesting because Gaultier, you would think, he's sort of, designer terrible of the fashion industry, where he's sort of known for being difficult. But working with Luc Besson, he was very open to iterating, and probably more so than a lot of collaborators of just trying to come up with new ideas. And I guess it was sort of for him, it was just a completely new experience going through all these characters. So you can see Li Lu and initial character designs, and then Ruby Rod, which is just, I mean, Chris Tucker was amazing in that role.
I heard that originally the actor who was going to play the part was Prince.
That's right. Yeah.
And Prince really wanted to do the part, but he was never, you could never get him on the phone and schedule. But he looked at some of these images. He said, "Oh, I think it's too feminine for me."
Yeah, right.
You can imagine costumes; they're too feminine for Prince.
Too feminine Prince. Yeah. Well, I mean, again, like if you can, in a way, if Luc Besson was directing Jean-Paul Gaultier and Prince was you can kind of see how he was channeling some of that inspiration for the designs. Yeah. But Chris Tucker was apparently his agents were extremely difficult. Yeah. So he was one of the top choices, and Luc Besson really wanted them, but got very fed up at the end and called up one of the two producers at Gaumont and said, I've had it. I don't want to deal with them anymore. Let's get rid of Chris. And he said, well, funny you mentioned that. 5 minutes ago, they signed the contract and he's a go. So he was sort of 5 minutes away from being in the film. And, again, as far as casting, it's pretty unique. I mean, again, Bruce Willis, Chris Tucker, Milla Jovovich, like you couldn't have predicted it, but Bruce especially, and the way his personality, very masculine, against the way Chris Tucker was representing Ruby Rod, was amazing.
Yeah. And then let's continue with some of the costumes.
Yeah. So again, some more Jean-Paul Gaultier's designs for some of the soldiers, and then the medic it's just really cool. Again, it's just something so unique for, I've had the opportunity to work on some great films, and there's nothing better than walking through, looking at all the concept design, but having someone who comes from fashion doing these designs, you can kind of see where he's thinking about how this might look on the runway, and so it's quite different. And then
I think, as you said, part of Besson's brilliance is he reached outside of the cinema world.
That's right.
Bring artists and collaborate. And a lot of great directors do that. When I worked with Coppola on Bram Stoker's Dracula, for example, we hired Eiko Ishioko, a Japanese designer who had never really worked on a big feature as a costume designer, because we wanted something unusual. And we got very unusual costumes. This is another great example of how that works.
Exactly. Well, I mean, even the original Star Wars, like all of the cast were completely unknown, and they were just, it's just amazing when, it just goes to show that when you take a risk and you have, someone who has this vision,
right,
they're able to kind of put the risk is mitigated by the strong vision of the great, creator or director, to kind of ensure that they make sure that they get what they want, rather than the studios saying, we're not going to proceed because this doesn't have actor X or actress Y.
Let's see what else.
Yeah, so we've got the Manchandouans, which is great, and I love the sort of sketch up of how the stunt performer may actually be inside, sit inside of it.
Yeah,
and an interesting thing with Fifth Element is, it's one of the films where it's a lot of sci-fi, but still maybe 80% of the effects and special effects were all done physically.
Yeah, and explain that to me, because I was reading somewhere that there was only like 182 visual effects shots in the whole movie.
That's right. Yeah.
Movies today have like 2,000 shots.
That's right, and it's 1,000 times better for it. Just because everything, it's like The Mandalorian. When we talk about something done more recently, when you are judicial about the CG digital effects, it just makes everything feel more natural and real and lifelike. And so, again, Luc he wanted to work with a lot of these puppeteers and people in France who had this traditional background. So I think part of it was, even he had people building these puppets even before the film was greenlit. So once it was greenlit, he kind of said, well, the work's already done.
Right.
Picasso's the little creature that sits on the desk. And and it's
Oh yeah.
constantly
Yeah.
looking at the, ends up, when the guy's choking on
And the cherry.
the cherry,
Yeah.
and he sort of gives him this draw. Like, it's such an emotive character, yet it was
And that was
a
a
simple
puppet,
puppet.
not a CGI
That's
character.
not
Yeah,
totally a puppet. Yeah. Whereas nowadays you'd bid that out as a CGI character, and
that's right.
it just, I whether or not the director gets exactly the performance they want versus how the creature puppet feels in situ in the scene is sort of a toss up of whether or not that one is better than the other, and
Right.
ultimately cost and fabrication and things like that. But again, like the Mashandawan creatures, when they're coming off the ship and they walk into the pyramids, it's just stunt performers in these amazing costumes that
There's no visual effect. Yeah.
there's no visual effect. And the interesting, as a visual effect artist, I look at that and my brain slowly sort of melts thinking about the amount of detail you need to put into, because we cut in really tightly on those creatures when they first come out of the ship, because it's all a part of establishing the mystery of these things moving off the ship. So you might see a close-up of a belt buckle or an arm and moving through this mist.
Right.
And really that could cost $50,000, $100,000 for that one shot in visual effects. And to be able to build the actual costumes, and then again, as Luc Besson, he can carry the camera around and find the shots he's looking for way more effectively.
I've heard, Colin, that Besson actually does a lot of the operating of the camera himself.
He does, yeah. And then I think, again, when he shot Atlantis, because he did Atlantis, which was his undersea documentary, right. He was, the first camera operator on that, because so he's quite technical. And in a way, he's sort of, I don't, maybe it's a bit of a stretch. He's almost like France's answer to James Cameron. He loves underwater. He builds these magical worlds, and is just completely technically proficient as far as being on set and understanding the cameras and how to operate them and everything. And the vision they have as well. I mean, and again, it was I think I mentioned, Luc Besson had met James Cameron, and they hit it off because they were talking about all the deep sea diving. And Cameron said, "I started Digital Domain. Why don't you reach out to these guys or this team to do the visual effects work?" And so, the visual effects supervisor was Mark Stetson, and I know Mark because I worked with Mark on Lord of the Rings. He was our original visual effects supervisor in Lord of the Rings, and his background is miniatures.
Yeah.
So as far as shooting this film and getting everything done in camera, I think that he was it's not that he was anti-CG, but I think he felt the confidence that, a lot of this work could be tackled very well by building it all miniatures. So the city outside of Corbin Dallas's apartment, when he walks out, that's all miniatures that were shot.
When you say miniatures, these are pretty large models.
Yeah,
they are.
Yeah,
they're not, but they're really big models, weren't they?
Yeah, they're big models that are shot with tiny cameras and with very small lenses, and a lot of the difficulties is matching lenses to ensure you get the right depth of field, and so you need a lot of light. And really, really sharp lenses to make sure you shoot them well. And that's something, and again, when you look at Lord of the Rings, especially Fellowship and Helm's Deep, we ended up taking the miniature concept, just did bigatures, where it's like whole sound stages filled
with miniatures.
But Mark was, again, that's his background. And I think that's why so much, a good chunk of the film was done that way, because of his, more of a, and I remember talking to Richard Edlund. Richard Edlund was the boss of the head of Boss Films, and they did The Abyss and a lot of other things. And he was also really into miniatures, and he'd also talking sort of about how so much CG is almost taking away from what really should be done in miniatures these days.
Yep.
So yeah, some great concept art of the police and the weapons that were designed.
Yeah. Fantastic.
And then,
there she is.
Yeah, she was amazing.
Yeah. The story I heard about this character, I forget her name. She has some.
It's just it was a.
The big opera singer. Well, you can see the little picture of her. So that character was actually played by Besson's wife.
Right.
And what he did, though, was because he wanted the impact of revealing her again, not a CGI. This was a real person, like on, like 14-foot stilts, but there's a person in that in that whole thing performing real, right? There's no visual effect. And he wanted the reaction from Bruce Willis and the audience to be tremendous. So no one ever got to see her.
Right.
And it was all hidden and done behind the scenes. And then literally they were rolling the camera and she walks out with this incredible outfit. And he made it sort of like a live event that way and could capture the reactions of Chris Tucker and everybody to something that no one had ever seen before.
Yeah.
And then someone asked us about the singing, and the singing was actually a combination of two voices. It was her voice, and I forget the woman's name, who was his wife at the time. And then there was also a more experienced opera singer, and then they mixed the two voices together, which became the performance.
I think the opera singer sort of took over for a lot of the higher notes, or very sort of more bite, and then sort of more of the subtle notes were from the actress or his wife who was playing it as well.
That's right.
And the there's sort of something about the scene, the emotion in the scene. It's sort of the crescendo in the music and the crescendo of what's happening with Lilu at the same time. It's just the cutting and the editorial for this whole sequence was just outstanding. And again, this is supposed to be a comedy, this sort of space romp, and yet the emotional impact of how this was all brought together, and the it's sort of the idea of, once you realize that Lilu represents love, it sort of almost makes the sadness of the whole situation even that much more impactful, where it's sort of something, the difference between something happening to an adult and a young child, and so I just love that whole sequence where
very emotional and heart, you couldn't help. I mean, just the performance and the song was just it was just so heart-wrenching.
Yeah. And it's sort of an interesting segue where there's the beats in the movie are really good too, and this is something that I think a lot of modern films really struggle with. Not modern, I guess this is modern, but with a lot of the Avenger films, it's just cadence and the beats and the emotional impact of everything that's happening in the film. And that's one thing that whether it's from the original script or when for the final shooting script, I guess it was introduced a lot more, just the tone and the arcs of emotions that happen where and again, and I think that's what really struck me when I originally watched the movie, is that reading the comic books and reading stories as a kid, I would end up in these sort of worlds in my head where I would have these own emotional cadences that I would sort of project onto myself. And then being able to watch this film, I sort of felt like Luc Besson almost was a child capturing the same imaginative impact that these different moments would have on the viewer.
I think you're so right. And there was a lot of criticism when it first came out that it was too long, because it was about 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Right, yeah.
It's a long film, and especially for that kind of action genre. But I think you're right, that I think if he had rushed through and just made it more of a action without taking a little more time for some of the emotional moments, it may not have been as interesting a movie. So.
That's right.
Oh my God, what's that? That's a set?
This is the design for Corbin Dallas's apartment that he built, which is, again, brilliant moment, like the idea of this little apartment, and then all of these sort of the amount of the story that takes place in such a tiny space, and a lot of the character development that happens as well between Corbin Dallas and everything. You learn about his relationship with his mom, his relationship with his previous job.
Right.
He sort of builds his fondness for Lilu in this room. He gets the general comes to visit in here, and they end up in the shower. So I thought it was a clever use of space for that. And then this is one of my favorite scenes in the whole film, is when he reaches out and orders his meal from the again, I spent quite a lot of time in Vietnam and Thailand on the floating villages, and it sort of was captured this exact same feeling of that. So there you go. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Yeah, there's a whimsy, to all the design that is kind of. I just think it allows the audience, as you say, to realize this is a ride. This is a fun ride. This isn't some heavy, sci-fi movie, and this is something, enjoy yourself, and have fun with it, even though deep down there were these kind of more, really, he did have an idea of what he wanted to do and say about the universe, and it's just incredible to me.
Yeah, and this angel constellation where it all takes part in,
Right.
you do have to wonder how much of that world could be expanded upon as well, because there's so much being related in when they go and they get transported to Fhloston Paradise, and they go to basically the airport, the spaceport, and again, such an amazing scene where they're cleaning the critters off the bottom of the ship and everything. But it gives you the sense that there's ships being, leaving to all corners of the constellation or other parts of the universe that, again, it adds a depth to it, because first of all, people are all leaving from there, and then you go to Fhloston Paradise and there's all these other cultures coming there as for this, opera moment, for the singing moment, which again is a very highbrow thing that would happen a lot in Europe, where you would sort of let's travel to Rome to see this opera, and it's sort of following along that line. So it's really amazing how well the world is constructed around the sense of scales, that you realize there's more happening outside of just what the storyline that we're in.
Yeah. Now, he actually shot the movie in England, I understand. Is that right?
That's right. He shot in Pinewood.
Pinewood, yeah.
Yeah, and apparently it was the 100th anniversary of film in France, and he was almost gutted that he had to go to England, because he really wanted to shoot it in France, and was trying to get the French government to pony up some extra cash to make it a little bit more financially viable to shoot it there in Paris, but they just didn't have the stage set size.
That's right. They didn't have. They no one. In fact, the budget was $90 million, which at the time was a lot of money. Now that's nothing. And it was the most expensive film ever made outside of Hollywood.
Yeah, yeah, and you can see that from the scope and the scale, but.
And also, I think they shot for like 6 months or something, which is unheard of, right?
That's right. Yeah, it was a huge shoot. Yeah, and I think that in the book, if you read it, he sort of there was a passage in this book that I actually read earlier, and I thought I would read it out because no, I forget exactly. It's just his. I overreached myself to be both entertaining and philosophical was beyond my powers. One can only sustain the other in small dosages. This is one of the many lessons I've learned from the film. There was an inherent ambiguity in wanting to make useful memories with an outlook now grown to adulthood. And many of the passages in the book was him, as any filmmaker in any film, not any film, but a lot of filmmakers, once you get going, once you move forward and it's this moving train, you generally spend 99% of the time just holding on and hoping that, the decisions you make, they're not necessarily the right decisions, they're just a decision. And
right. You have to give them an answer, even if you don't know, because otherwise everything stops.
And you have a full set, especially if you're in Pinewood and, the amount of money being spent. And again, that's when you look at filmmakers like Luc Besson and James Cameron. You have to, and maybe after working on the project for 20 years, you sort of had this innate second sense of being able to answer the questions more concisely and clearly.
Yeah, I think Bruce Willis talks about, because Bruce Willis is notoriously not the easiest person to get along with, but he actually was, according to the stories, great on this movie. Very patient, worked well, and with everybody, and of course I think he gave a great performance. And what he said was that it was a joy because Besson knew exactly what he wanted, right? So there was never any question about, what to do it this way, do it that way. He could tell you right away, this is what I want, this is what I want. And actors love that. I mean, obviously they want to add their own thoughts, but it's when they work with the indecisive. Well, let's try it that way. Let's give it. Maybe it's a style, because some directors like to work that way and do 30 takes and all that. But what he really liked about Besson, respected so much, was he was a guy who really knew what he wanted all the time, and that kept, the energy of the whole show together. Really great.
Yeah.
What I also admire about him is the ambition, because let's face it, a lot of people just, this was a very ambitious movie.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And I know that there's a lot of, criticism. In fact, when it came to the Academy Awards, believe it or not, it wasn't even nominated for Best Visual Effects. I find that shocking today, and I don't think it would happen today. The only thing it was nominated for was Best Sound Editing.
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing
that happened. That's just shocking to me.
The sound was great. I'm surprised that longtime collaborator Eric Serra for Luc Besson, again, before I saw The Big Blue, I managed to get my hands on the soundtrack for The Big Blue.
Yep.
And that was, and the soundtrack for Fifth Element just made it as well. It's something that in a way, I think the most recent one to have a similar impact was the new version of Tron, where they got I've just lost it. Anyway, they got the French DJ producers to actually do the soundtrack to that as well. And Eric Serra really only usually just works with Luc Besson. Otherwise, he's doing his own albums and everything.
That's right.
And so it's fantastic. But you mentioned visual effects, and although there was only 100 or so visual effects, I remember them being extremely complicated. And this was one of the very first films to work with a university to get human bone scans, because when Leela's being reconstructed, they put the Manchuan hand in, and it starts building up the bone section by section. And so they actually had worked with one of the university hospitals in Los Angeles to get these scans of a lady's muscles and bones, pulled those apart, and procedurally worked out how to do these, muscle fibers forming. And again, being in the industry at the time, watching that, it just blew my mind to think wow, where did they get the idea to get all this data and to assemble, how, it was a ton of work. So even though there was only a handful, nowadays it would be considered a handful of visual effects shots, they were pretty complex. And the planet that's constantly changing and moving and coming towards them, that was a very complicated, that was, the procedural surface of the planet to get that looking correct. There was a lot of iterations and work done on that to make that work properly as well. So
we forgot to mention Gary Oldman, of course.
Oh, yeah.
He's such a fantastic actor, and this was a bizarre part for him. And as I understand the story, Gary was not necessarily a huge fan of this movie. But
no. He's so I don't know if we've heard this.
Well, there's stories. So let me tell you about the story. I heard though was that he was going to he wanted to direct a movie called Kneel by Mouth, right? I don't know if you guys know that movie, but Gary directed a small, low budget art film, and Luc Besson agreed to be the producer and agreed to get the financing for his film. And in return, Gary agreed to do this part.
Yeah, I think so. There was, I guess, the joke was that Luc Besson agreed to get the financing for Gary's film without having read the script.
Oh, okay.
So Gary Oldman actually agreed to do this film without having read the script.
Okay.
But he had also worked with Luc Besson previously on The Professional.
That's right.
So kind of, I guess, it knew his directing style. But I think what was more of a surprise is quite a different character. Not as, the character that he plays in The Professional is, I guess, maybe traditional Gary Oldman. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah, but this one is more, a bit more of a not a farce, but quite
extreme character.
Yeah,
and coming up with that South Texas accent, for
that's
the character. Right. They really pushed that character into a whole other. But it fit within the aesthetic of the performances in the film. I just and again, I certainly having Gary Oldman in the film was, and the funny thing is when you think about it though, someone I read, there's no scene between Gary Oldman and Bruce Willis.
That's right.
They never appear in a scene together, even though they're the protagonist and the antagonist. There's never a scene they're in together. So
yeah, and I don't know if that was a decision because it just happened that way, or
Maybe
if
it
it
was
was a
logistically, or
logistics. Yeah,
it
yeah,
was always his plan. He just never wrote a scene for the two of them together.
yeah.
Because you could
But
imagine that it would have been an interesting scene. Because
well, but Gary Oldman's in Die Hard, isn't he?
no, I meant in this movie.
In this movie, yeah, I know. Like just they've been together
Oh,
before.
they've been together in other movies.
Many
But I
many
meant in
times.
this
Yeah, so
movie, it's just a little unusual that there's no
yeah,
scene that they both
that's right. Yeah.
together, which is kind of interesting. So I had a question from Becca about hair and Mila's hair,
Right.
because as people notice, it sort of changes throughout the movie a little bit. And in fact, there are times you can almost see the blonde roots. Anyhow, the story, as I understand it, is it originally started with her hair and they dyed it. But the constant dyeing of it actually destroyed her hair.
Yeah.
So then at some point they had to switch to a wig. So yes, if you look carefully, there's a lot of confusing and inconsistency to her hair. And it was a problem, and they were just hoping people would notice, I guess. It was not intentional.
No, and I also think so. There was definitely the inconsistency as far as dyeing in a wig.
Yeah.
I think one of the other problems they had was just lighting the shots,
Yeah.
because she had very bright orange hair.
Yeah.
And in some scenes, you could actually, the DOP was able to light the shots where you could actually see the warmth of the orange. But some of the shots are quite cool and lit with very cool lights, which sucks a lot of the color out. So I think some of it has to do with the overall just saturation of the film, and the struggle of, if you had a scene that's very cool and dark, trying to light a character to maintain that bright orange hair is just really difficult.
Yeah.
And I think that's when when we first see her, she's in the room and it's all gold and gold plated and really warm to begin with, because they lit it in a way where they wanted to be able to punch out her eyes with the bright blue and then just maintain this richness in her hair. But yeah, it's always the struggle with prosthetics and props and anything that's oversaturated in filmmaking, where when you're on set and you're trying to light the set with the characters and multiple creatures, it's to get to the point where everything looks consistently great and nothing looks dulled or done, beaten down is really difficult, as you know. And same with makeup as well. Like if you have, I know in some of the shots with the diva and trying to light her, I think they actually had to change a lot of the lighting setups from angle to angle, because she was so blue and so saturated that to get to really maintain that sort of richness that they wanted to. And when Chris Rock sticks his hands in and the blue blood comes out, and that was a hard to light, because the actual element stones that they pull out, they were trying to punch those out and light them so they were really shiny. But whenever they lit it that way, the richness of the diva would disappear. So it was an interesting struggle for them to do that. So I think they actually tried to, in post, they did a lot of color correction on that to sort of punch it out more.
We have a question from Spencer about Oldman's design, look and his costume and that face shield. Do we? I don't think it's ever explained why he has like a plastic shield kind of on his face, or.
No, it's never actually explained. There is a point, and so there's a bit of Luc Besson when he grew up where he had ailments as a child, and some of these ailments, he felt led to various personality traits to him. And if one could potentially extrapolate the idea that maybe Gary Oldman's character as a child or growing up or something happened to him, and this faceplate alludes to maybe an ailment or some differentiator that puts him separates him from the rest of the world. Because you get, he has his industry, his business where they build these weapons, and he's, Zorg's Industries, and they've completely separated himself in this golden tower from the rest of society in a way. You get that sense. And he actually has this very succinct moment in the film where he talks about dying on his own, or sorry, Ian Holm helps him when he's choking on the cherry, and
Yes.
Ian Holmes says, "Do you want to stand up here in your ivory,
Right.
dying on your own?" And so I think that's, a bit
Yeah.
of it is that.
That I agree with you. It separated. It immediately told us as soon as we saw him, this guy wasn't completely human, and maybe that
That's right.
his megalomaniac nature, that maybe there was something even slightly either a disability or something mechanical. What I never really understood though is he seems to be in partnership with evil, right?
Yeah,
But I
Mr.
never
Evil.
understand what was he going to get out of it? How was he going to benefit? Because when this thing showed up, he wasn't going to survive either. Nobody was.
Well, I mean, it's, you could probably screen that today and talk about a zeitgeist, right?
Yeah.
What does, erring on the side of, benefiting from more power. I think it's always the sense of
I
gaining
know.
more power, right? And some people, again, it's the idea of like, maybe he's just on this path where he's blinded by this power, so there's no clear win other than it'll make him ideally more powerful in the eyes of others. So but again, it's a very deep film. Like it's when Bruce Willis read it, and Luc Besson came back, the first thing Bruce said to Luc Besson was, "So I just want to check, are you making a comedy or are you making an action film?" And Luc Besson said, "Well, it's a comedy with action." He's like, "Okay, good, I get it, I understand it." Because again, if you don't have any visuals and you read the script and you kind of go through these moments, you'd have to question what is the intention of the vision of the story you're trying to tell. Is it?
What I admired so much about it is that it felt alive. That a lot of these visual effects movies feel almost over designed, over planned. Even the performances are sometimes a little wooden. It's just, I think Besson was brilliant to do tricks like not revealing, the diva to the actors until the actual moment of the shot. And I actually heard that Bruce Willis's character actually had never seen Mila in her, white bondage costume until they actually shot the scene where she falls through the, into the taxi, and he turns around and there's this girl. He didn't know what she was going to look like or what she, how she was going to talk. And so, his reaction is so natural, right? It feels so lifelike, because he really didn't know. Here's some of this beautiful naked 5'9" model in the back of his, the set with him and talking in this weird language. And you could see his performance feels, I don't know, I think it's one of Bruce Willis's best performances in this movie.
I was about to say, and I think, a lot of it could be because of that directing style where, if he was set up and prepared, it's almost needs to be, Bruce Willis is a very cool person and a very interesting actor, but needs to be primed in different ways. And it's more and I guess what you want to get is more that natural reaction to the moment rather than something overthought, or else it's sort of too manufactured, and you see that a lot in some of his other roles. So I think with having to have such a large, well-known actor that might not be known for very emotional roles, it worked very well.
No, that's and to me it's a little tragic too, because I don't know that the song. I mean, he's been a bit hit or miss in films, and people often talk about. They're always beautifully stylish films, but that sometimes he seems to be more interested in the form of the film than the content of the film. And I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about his future career after this? And someone was also wondering why there's never been a sequel to this movie, because it was so successful. But I don't really understand his career in a way, and what's happened to him, because he's had a few successes, but he's had some giant flops too.
Yeah, I think for, he's working outside of the world of Hollywood. That's and right. I feel like in some ways it might be more forgiving in that you're, in Hollywood, if you have a flop, and it's really hard to dig yourself back out of that career if you're maybe not in Hollywood or elsewhere. He has a fairly, good, or had a fairly good reputation in France.
And also, he was a big producer and did a lot of
exactly
television, right?
So he was doing, by the time, he's doing a lot more than just making his films. And although the films were considered flops, they're also very large films coming out of, outside of the US. And someone who was able, when you think about it, someone even able to get a film finished, let alone something like Fifth Element.
Such a miracle.
First of all, you have to have something right. And then second of all, you also have to have a screw loose to actually want to kind of go and shoot another film, because it's, fairly rigorous at times. But I think, even, maybe The Fifth Element is an interesting analogy for his career, where he struggles between the wonderment of being a child and the story he wanted to tell, and then other stories you're trying to tell as an adult, because your outlook on life is quite different. And I think some of the films, his more successful films, are the ones told from the story viewpoint of a child. Like Big Blue was written as a way he was experienced life growing up with his parents. The Professional was, written from the standpoint of Natalie Portman. And even this one, like Lilu, and her role is quite childlike. And
Nikita,
exactly, like she, lost and sort of an outsider. And first of all, maybe there's only so many stories you can kind of tell with that structure, and second of all is that as he moves on his career, and as you move on in life, your outlook is quite different. And it may just become harder for him to reach down deep and find the stories that he wants to tell.
I agree. Often this happens when they're, he was in his 30s when he made this movie. He wasn't a kid, but as you say, the story came from a point in his life when he was emerging as an artist and discovering himself. And it's very hard to keep that going when you're in your 40s and your 50s and you're on your fourth marriage and you're worried about going bankrupt with your studio complex. And
well, that's he's been running like Europa. He's been running that basically went bankrupt, and then there's life just gets in the way, and that's what well, just to get in the way, but and this is one thing with the industry with what is it, you've got people like Spielberg and Lucas who effectively retired, and even when you look at Peter Jackson, I don't know what he's going to be doing. And
he'll do
sort of feel like
he'll do,
and it's almost like the industry needs to be, primed for providing a platform for younger filmmakers that might, so Luc Besson, it would be great if Europa or his production company, they could, I know that he does work with schools and to help bring other up and coming filmmakers, but taking even a bigger risk on them and sort of saying, look, this filmmaker has the same heart and soul as I did when I was at that stage. Let's take a chance on this person.
And then Colin, let's face it, the industry is so different, right?
For sure.
There's just no comparison. Things cost $200 million now, and corporation, it's not, the decisions aren't being made by filmmakers anymore about.
But even with The Fifth Element, when you talk about a sequel, I mean, a lot of companies, even 98, 99. You might have been able to tease out a storyline of what happened next or something.
Right.
But even if you did, as much as I'd love to have a Lilu action figure and a Corbin Dallas action figure, the life beyond the cinematic presentation of Fifth Element really wasn't there. Like, I think maybe there's a few comic books that were made, which is a great.
No, listen, you're right. It has to always come down to story. Of course, Mila had all this great training, which became very valuable because, of course, she became the star of the Resident Evil franchise.
That's right.
It was all shot in Canada, and I think she repeated that role like 5 times, right? Or 5 Resident Evil stories. So. It just really depends. And that was a big commercial success, but obviously was not a critically acclaimed movie. It was, it was just sort of a programmer. So
for Resident Evil.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was based off popular Japanese video games as well. Right. So I think that already had, it's not that it was a no-brainer, but it was, had a very established audience already.
Well, listen, this was great. Thank you so much. A couple of things I just want to say before we close, everybody. Any last questions, please send them. But as I mentioned, since the Westdale closed on March 16th, this is the 16th week we brought you a film talk. And by the way, all the talks are on Facebook Live and YouTube at the Westdale. And you might want to go back and check some of them out. They're quite good. In fact, last week we did a wonderful movie called Black Cop, a small Canadian micro-budget film, but we had the director and the star on it, and it could have been made yesterday, even though it was made 3 years ago. And it's just been great fun for me. But this, in fact, is going to be the last one that we're going to do on Monday night. And it concludes our series because we're now going to be moving a very successful online music series we've been doing called Hamilton Originals, live from the Westdale. And not next week, but 2 weeks from now, or soon, it starts up again, and it's at 8 p.m. And we shoot them live on theater at the theater, but there's no audience. We just then present them on Facebook, and you can just go to the westdale.ca. And we have some wonderful guests coming on. Laura Cole is going to be with us, Steve Strongman, Red Green, Boris Brott. Ian Thomas is coming in a month or so. So please join us Monday night for those music shows. And then, of course, the theater is now opened. We opened on Friday, and we can have 50 people there at one time, and safe social distancing, all the health protocols, as you know. And that's actually very exciting for all of us. And in fact, we actually did sell out on Sunday night. We showed Breakfast at Tiffany's, and a lot of people came for that. It was quite a wonderful thing. And we're going to be moving these film talks to the theater. So again, it's coming up in the next week or two, but check the calendar, check the schedules. I'm going to go down there, often have a guest with me. We'll talk before the film, show a film, talk a little after, answer questions. Very exciting. There have been so many people who have helped, make this happen. I think it's going to probably be Thursday nights, but all this is just getting set up. So give us your email so we know how to get in touch with you. This weekend coming up, we're going to be showing The Maltese Falcon. This is a great opportunity for you to see movies you may have seen before, but never seen, on the screen, a DCP, great print. We're also going to have family matinees Saturday and Sunday. Jungle Book, the newest Jungle Book. Did you see that, Colin? The Jon Favreau?
Yes, yeah.
It's kind of extraordinary, isn't it?
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's a lot of work. I can't help watching it.
It's not the old animated version. It's this new live action version on Saturday and Sunday, matinees for families. And so lots of great things are still to come. So anyhow, I just want to thank everybody who's been watching on these Monday nights. It's been a great pleasure for me. Quite honestly, it helped keep me sane during this COVID experience and pandemic to have fun researching the movies, watching them again, talking to you all about them, answering questions. And Colin, I hope we'll have you down there at the theater soon, and look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for all these fantastic talks you've been doing. I know it's the community appreciates the effort.
Well, anyhow, that's what we're here for at the Westdale, and we are a charitable organization, and we haven't charged for any of this, as you know. So donations are very welcome. Thank you very much, because we really, as everybody, this has been a very challenging financial time for us too. Okay, thank you all.
Right.
Be good.
Good night.
Be safe. Bye-bye.